Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlight Series. Today we look at Benchmark 1.3, where we will trace the impact that the Magna Carta, Mayflower Compact, English Bill of Rights, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense had on colonists' views of government. In Part 1, we look at the important ideas included in the Magna Carta and the Mayflower Compact. So what are we going to be looking at today? Benchmark Clarification 1 includes that students will identify the important ideas contained in the Magna Carta, which would include due process of law, limitation of government power, the right to justice, and the right to a fair trial, as well as the Mayflower Compact, which includes a focus on consent of the governed and self-government. We'll be looking at the other elements of Benchmark Clarification 1 in a separate PowerPoint. We'll be looking at what are the principles that were included in the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, and what are some examples of those principles from the Magna Carta and the Mayflower Compact presented in founding documents. So let's take our first look at the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was an English document that was adopted in 1215, so it was written hundreds of years ago. It's very difficult and challenging to read because it's written in English, but it's a form of English that most people living in the United States are not used to. So we focus on the concept of the due process of law, and that is the right of people accused of crimes to have laws that treat them fairly, so that they cannot lose their life or freedom without having their legal rights protected in the process. So what this means is that whether a person has been accused of a crime or they've been even convicted of a crime, there are still a set of fair procedures to focus on what happens to a person when they are accused of a crime. If they're convicted of a crime, what happens to them then? Well, if they are convicted of a crime, they can lose their freedom. They could even lose their life in extreme circumstances, but there is a process for making that determination, that when we're focusing on how we treat people in terms of how the law treats them, there are procedures in place. There's also a focus on the limitation of government power. Government power is limited by a constitution or other governing document. This means that the powers of government are written down. The powers of government are written down. And that means that those powers are limited to whatever is included in that document. There is also a principle included in the Magna Carta focusing on the right to justice. This means that people know what their rights are, they are able to protect those rights, and they're also able to secure a fair outcome that will be enforced. This is an obligation of government to make sure that people understand what their rights are, that people are able to, that the government protect the people's rights, and that the government have procedures in place, such as due process of law, that secure a fair outcome that will then be enforced. And what about the right to a fair trial? The right to a fair trial is determined by a judge and a jury who determines the facts and makes a judgment of guilty or not guilty. This means that a person has a right to have facts presented about them and on their behalf when they're being held accountable for a crime that they are accused of committing. And that there's also an interplay between a jury who determines, based on the facts, whether or not the person is guilty or not, and a judge who makes certain that that trial was done fairly to ensure that the accused person had every right to have evidence presented in their defense. Now, there are going to be some trials where the person who determines guilt or not guilty, that's going to be a judge. So it's not that every trial is a jury trial, but every trial whether a jury trial or not does include a judge. Now, what about the principles included in the Mayflower Compact? One of the principles that's very important is the consent of the governed. With the consent of the governed, there is an agreement made by the people to establish a government and abide by its laws. So the people make the laws through their representatives or on their own as a collective, and they consent to being governed. They consent that they are part of a larger group, that for the sake of the common good and the need for order in society, that they will agree to abide by the laws. And the Mayflower Compact also includes the principle of self-government. This means that the people form their own government and then live by their own authority as established by that government. So people, by having the privilege of being part of that particular society that has a self-government, they're also agreeing to live by the rules of that self-government, but then they also get the protections of that self-government, which means that, for example, if part of that self-government is that people are not allowed by law to steal from one another, if a person is part of that community that says we don't steal from one another and that's the law, I feel safer because I am safe that someone is less likely to steal from me because there's going to be consequences if they steal from me. So it's not just that I decide I'm not going to steal from other people, but I also feel protected because I don't want to be held accountable for it, but I also feel protected because other people then will be discouraged from stealing from me because of the laws against stealing. So let's look at some examples of principles from the Magna Carta and the Mayflower Compact that are presented in the founding documents. And on this slide, we have two from the Magna Carta and two from the Mayflower Compact. So the due process of law, we see an excerpt there, and as I mentioned before, this is Old English, so it's a little difficult to read and a little difficult to unpack. No freeman shall be taken or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him nor send upon him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And so what this means in words that we use today, no person who is free can in any way be destroyed, can have any of that freedom taken away from them, except if there has been a lawful judgment of his peers. So meaning, had there been a jury in place that says you are a free person, but we have the right to take freedom away from you because you broke some laws, or if that person has been determined perhaps by a judge or even by their own admission that they broke the law of the land. But there is a due process in place that if a person is thought of as accused of committing a crime, then they cannot lose their freedom unless a jury or a judge takes that freedom away. But yet at the same time, there are some people who commit crimes who they admit to it because they know that their sentence might be a bit lighter if they sort of save the government all the time and the process of going through a trial. They may get a lighter sentence because of it, or they may help out the government in some other way. The Magna Carta also says, to no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. So this is focusing on the right to justice, that we are not going to refuse or delay somebody's right to their justice. This is a very important principle to us. Now in the Mayflower Compact, we see the consent of the governed, focusing on this idea, by virtue hereof to enact, constitute and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitution, and offices as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. The Mayflower Compact was written by people who had grown up in England, and they came to what we now call the United States in 1620. And so again, they use a form of English that is a little more difficult for most people living in the United States to understand. But you can see it saying, we enacted laws, and we consider them to be just, meaning they follow justice principles, and they are equal to all people, and we also have people holding office who are here to support what we've done, and this is all for the sake of the general good. So we have laws, we have ordinances, we have acts. They are just and equal, and they are supportive of the common good, for the general good of the colony. And then finally, we look at self-government. Solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic. So here we have this idea that the people are coming together, forming their own government for the sake of establishing this civil body politic for the general good of the colony, as was mentioned in the consent of the governed description. So the people govern themselves, and they do so in a civil manner, in a manner that provides order, liberty and order together, so that the people can be protected and protect what is important to them, which is to keep their community well sustained. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? Please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.